They called the cops before I even unloaded my boxes. The HOA said I didn't belong there, that I was trespassing. But what they didn't know was this: I didn't just buy a house. I bought their entire lakefront. And by the time they realized it, it was way too late. The morning air over Lake Meriden was crisp, calm, and perfectly still, the kind of morning where you'd expect peace, not chaos. A moving truck rumbled down the narrow private road that wound around the lake, its engine breaking the silence that had long belonged to the Homeowners Association. Inside that truck were the remnants of a man's old life: heavy oak furniture, fishing rods, and tools packed with precision. It wasn't just a move. It was a beginning. The new owner had arrived quietly, no fancy cars, no realtor banners, no open house tours. Just a man with a key that would soon unlock chaos in a neighborhood built on control. As the truck backed into the long gravel driveway, curious eyes peeked through expensive blinds. Doors cracked open, and whispers began spreading faster than wildfire. The HOA president, a woman named Carol who lived 3 houses down, watched every move like a hawk eyeing prey. To her, every truck that entered the neighborhood was a potential threat to her order. And this one, with its unregistered delivery crew and a man who didn't stop to introduce himself, was the ultimate red flag. She made her first call within 20 minutes. Not to the new neighbor. Not to the moving company. But to the police. From her perspective, she was protecting the neighborhood. From the new owner's perspective, it was the first sign of the storm he'd soon unleash. By the time he carried the third box inside, 2 squad cars rolled up the street, lights flashing, engines humming, neighbors stepping out onto lawns pretending to check the mail. The show had begun. The officers stepped out, puzzled but polite, asking about a possible trespassing report. The new owner looked confused, but calm. After all, he had paperwork. But paperwork didn't matter to people like Carol, not until it was too late. The HOA members gathered like spectators at a play. They whispered assumptions, rumors, and accusations. To them, he was an outsider, maybe even a squatter. They didn't know his name, his background, or his plans. They only knew he didn't fit their version of perfection. But behind his quiet demeanor was something they couldn't see: power. Not arrogance. Not wealth flaunted through cars or clothes. Real power. The kind that came from ownership, the kind that came with deeds, land titles, and contracts sealed long before their suburban reign ever began. That evening, when the police left, after confirming everything was legal, Carol stormed off in disbelief. She told her board they'd look into this. She wanted to make things difficult. She always did. But she had no idea who she was up against. Because the man who moved into that lakeside property didn't just buy the old Benson estate. He bought the land beneath her home, the easements along the lake, and the access rights that the HOA didn't even realize they'd lost years ago. For him, this wasn't just about moving in. It was about reclaiming something much bigger. Something personal. And as night fell over Lake Meriden, the whispers of that day settled into uneasy silence. But the tension had only begun to simmer. Tomorrow, the HOA would try again, and that's when things would truly explode. The next morning at Lake Meriden began deceptively calm. The surface of the lake mirrored the pastel sky, and early fog clung to the water like thin smoke. But underneath that quiet beauty, the neighborhood buzzed with tension. What happened yesterday had traveled through every mailbox, text chain, and gossip call. The new guy who moved into the old Benson estate was the most talked about person in the entire community. Carol, the HOA president, started her day with purpose. Her silver sedan was parked in front of the community office by 7:15 a.m. She carried a thick binder labeled Neighborhood Compliance, the same one she used as a weapon to control everything from fence height to mailbox color. For years, she ruled this lakeside community through fear and paperwork, and she wasn't about to lose that control to someone she hadn't approved. Her version of the story had already twisted overnight. By the time the HOA board met that morning, the rumor was that the new owner had illegally occupied the Benson property. Carol called an emergency meeting, her voice trembling with fake urgency. The board, a mix of retirees and self-appointed enforcers, nodded along as she spoke. They didn't need proof, they just needed a target. At 9 a.m., a letter went out to every mailbox on the street. Unverified occupancy, it read, printed in red across the top. It warned residents about unauthorized individuals and asked everyone to report suspicious activity. The new homeowner hadn't even finished unpacking his boxes before the HOA declared war. Across the lake, inside the partially furnished house, the man was quietly eating breakfast. His name, still unknown to most of the neighbors, was Ethan Cole, a former real estate developer who had spent years away from the spotlight. He had chosen this place for peace. Ironically, peace was the one thing this neighborhood refused to give him. Ethan had already noticed the shift in energy. Cars slowed in front of his driveway. Joggers changed their routes to pass by. A woman even pretended to walk her dog just to peek through his windows. He didn't mind, not yet. He had seen people like this before, homeowners who confused property rules with personal power. He was patient, methodical, and far more prepared than anyone realized. By midday, Carol showed up again, clipboard in hand, wearing her signature oversized sunglasses like armor. She stood outside Ethan's gate, pretending to inspect the mailbox. Her heart pounded with self-righteous anger. She believed she was protecting her community from chaos, but in truth, she was protecting her ego. Later that afternoon, another letter arrived, this one addressed directly to Ethan. It listed violations that bordered on absurdity, unauthorized moving truck noise, failure to register occupancy with the HOA, and possible non-compliance with aesthetic standards. It was a message, not a rule. You don't belong here. Ethan read it once, smiled faintly, and placed it neatly in a folder labeled Evidence. He didn't respond. Not yet. That evening, as the sun began to set, Carol gathered her most loyal board members for a walkthrough of the lakefront. They moved in a slow, deliberate line like patrol guards, noting every minor imperfection in fences, lawns, and mailboxes. When they reached Ethan's property, they lingered. Carol stared at his newly painted dock, a simple, clean restoration project he had started that morning, and wrote something down in her notepad. Violation of shared waterfront policy, she whispered. The irony, of course, was that there was no shared waterfront policy anymore. It had expired years ago when the land rights transferred. But Carol didn't know that. She still believed the HOA controlled every inch of shoreline. The next day, Ethan drove to the county clerk's office with a calmness that only comes from confidence. He had already reviewed the original property deeds, not just for his home, but for the entire lake perimeter. Decades ago, the original owner of the land had subdivided it, selling off home plots while maintaining ownership of the lakefront and access rights. Over the years, paperwork had been lost, and the HOA simply assumed control. Ethan's company had quietly purchased those remaining rights months before the sale of the house. On paper, and in law, he didn't just own his property. He owned the lakefront strip beneath nearly every home in the neighborhood. That evening, Carol's phone buzzed nonstop. Neighbors complained that Ethan's construction crew was making too much noise near the dock. Someone claimed he was blocking access to community land. Carol called the county enforcement office, only to be told that the property was fully private, legally protected under the name of Cole Holdings LLC. That name didn't mean much to her at first, until she searched it online. Cole Holdings had developed multiple luxury estates across 3 states. It wasn't a stranger's name. It was a brand. And it suddenly explained the quiet confidence she'd seen in his eyes. But instead of backing down, Carol doubled down. She ordered a full neighborhood inspection for the coming weekend. Flyers appeared on every door, mandatory HOA presence required. We will address community concerns. The message was clear, they were coming for him. Ethan spent the next few days preparing, not with confrontation but with documentation. Every call, every note, every form of harassment was carefully logged. He photographed the letters, recorded the drive-bys, and even installed discreet cameras at the gate. To the HOA, it looked like he was ignoring them. In truth, he was quietly building a case. By Friday, tension hung over Lake Meriden like humidity before a storm. People whispered about the inspection as if it were a neighborhood festival. Carol walked door to door, convincing residents that they were defending their rights. Most followed her blindly. Some, however, had begun to question her motives, especially when they saw how unbothered Ethan remained. Saturday arrived. The board gathered at noon, clipboards in hand, cameras ready, and tempers high. They marched down the private road toward Ethan's property, determined to confront him face to face. Neighbors watched from their porches, phones out, ready to film what they thought would be another HOA victory. But when Carol reached the gate, something unexpected happened. The gate didn't just close, it locked automatically, controlled by a keypad system Ethan had installed overnight. On the fence, a new sign gleamed in the sun. Private property, Cole Holdings Lakefront. Access restricted. For the first time, Carol froze. Her authority had just met a wall of legal reality. The land she thought she ruled wasn't hers to control anymore. The property she accused someone of trespassing on was now the ground beneath her entire community. She stepped back, her face pale, the murmurs of the crowd behind her turning to confusion. Ethan appeared at the edge of his porch, calm, silent, watching the spectacle unfold. He didn't shout, didn't wave, didn't even smirk. He simply stood there, a quiet reminder that power doesn't need to announce itself. The board members argued quietly among themselves. Some suggested leaving before making it worse. Others wanted to call law enforcement again. Carol's hands shook as she dialed, repeating the same words she had used days earlier. "We have a situation at the lakefront." But this time, the response would be very different. Because when the police arrived, they weren't coming to question Ethan. They were coming to question her. And as those sirens echoed once more over the still water, Carol began to realize that the game she started was about to turn against her completely. The sirens came softer this time, almost hesitant, as if the officers themselves already knew they were walking into something far bigger than a neighborly dispute. By the time the patrol cars stopped near the gate, most of the neighborhood had already gathered, drawn by the sound, the tension, and the curiosity of watching their HOA president face the very system she once controlled. Carol stood stiffly at the edge of the property, her clipboard pressed tight to her chest. Her authority, once absolute, now trembled in her hands. She had called 911 again, the same call she made just days ago, but the air around her no longer carried the same confidence. Instead, it carried unease. The officers stepped out slowly, one of them recognizing the address from their last visit. They looked around, taking in the crowd, the locked gate, and the tall, private property, Cole Holdings Lakefront sign gleaming in the sunlight. Their eyes met Ethan's for a brief moment, calm, unwavering, almost serene. Then one of them turned to Carol and asked the question that shattered the illusion of her control. "Ma'am, what exactly is the emergency this time?" She hesitated. The words didn't come easily. He's blocking access to the lake," she finally managed. "That land belongs to the community." The officer frowned, glancing at his notes. "According to county records, ma'am, this property and the lakefront easement fall under private ownership. Cole Holdings LLC. The crowd stirred. Whispers broke out. Someone in the back muttered, "Private? What does that mean for us?" Carol's face drained of color. "That can't be right," she snapped. "That has to be a mistake. We've had lake access for decades." The officer simply nodded, uninterested in the argument. "If you have concerns, you'll need to take it up with the county or civil court. But for now, this man is within his rights." It was over before it began. The officers turned, leaving Carol standing in silence as her audience, her board, her neighbors, her loyal followers, watched her authority evaporate in real time. The scene that unfolded wasn't loud. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that comes when people realize the person leading them never really had power, only the illusion of it. Ethan didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply stepped back inside, letting the echo of that silence do the talking. Inside, he poured himself a cup of coffee and looked out over the water. The reflection of the setting sun rippled across the lake, his lake. And for the first time, it truly felt like his. That night, the neighborhood split in two. Half the residents were furious, blaming Carol for dragging them into humiliation. The other half were confused, trying to understand how they had lived under a false assumption for years. HOA chat groups exploded with panic. Questions flooded the board's inbox. What does this mean? Do we still have rights to the water? Can he block access? Carol didn't respond. For the first time in years, she didn't have an answer. The truth was buried in paperwork older than most of the homes themselves. Decades ago, when Lake Meriden Estates was developed, the land surrounding the water was never fully transferred to the HOA. The original developer retained ownership, something the HOA's founding members either overlooked or ignored. Over time, it was simply assumed that community use meant ownership. But legal assumption is a fragile thing, especially when someone like Ethan Cole steps in with proof. Early the next morning, Ethan drove to the county archives, pulling out every historical document tied to Lake Meriden. What he found was a timeline of neglect and oversight. The HOA had never once renewed their easement rights. Their lake usage had been a courtesy, not a contract. As he left the courthouse, he made one quiet decision: he wasn't going to punish anyone. Not yet. But he also wasn't going to tolerate harassment anymore. He had moved here for peace, and if the HOA couldn't give him that, he'd take it, legally, permanently, and completely. Meanwhile, Carol's grip on her position began to crumble. Several board members resigned within days, citing personal stress and community tension. Her once loyal circle began distancing themselves. She spent her nights scrolling through legal documents, trying to find a loophole, a clause, anything that could restore her control. But the more she searched, the clearer the truth became: she had built her little empire on borrowed land. Then came the letter. Delivered on crisp white paper with a gold-embossed header, it arrived in the HOA mailbox 3 days later. It wasn't aggressive. It was professional, courteous, and devastating. Effective immediately, it read, Cole Holdings LLC will be assuming full management of all lakefront maintenance and access operations. All existing HOA easements and dock permits are hereby suspended pending verification of compliance with updated property law. The letter was signed by Ethan Cole himself. It didn't just reclaim the land, it stripped the HOA of its most valuable bargaining chip, the lake. Without the lake, their fees, their meetings, and their so-called community privileges lost meaning. The homeowners who once obeyed Carol's every demand were suddenly questioning what they were paying for. Within a week, a quiet rebellion began. Residents stopped attending HOA meetings. Fees went unpaid. The HOA website, once a hub of rigid announcements, went dark. But Ethan wasn't celebrating. He saw the unraveling community for what it was, a lesson in control. And yet, part of him felt something deeper, pity. He didn't hate these people. He understood them. They had built their lives around belonging to something, even if that something was just a set of made-up rules. Still, he couldn't ignore what they had done to him. The humiliation, the calls to police, the invasion of privacy, it wasn't going to go unanswered forever. A few days later, Ethan began the quiet process of transformation. Surveyors arrived to map the lakefront. Fencing crews began marking boundaries that had never been enforced before. And rumors spread faster than ever. "Is he building a private marina?" one neighbor whispered. "He's turning it into a resort," said another. "He's taking everything from us," cried Carol at the last, nearly empty HOA meeting. But no one came to agree with her this time. Her voice echoed in an empty hall, the sound of power fading into irrelevance. As construction began, Ethan watched from his porch, coffee in hand, as trucks rolled down the same path that once carried his moving van, the same path that triggered the 911 call. He smiled faintly at the irony. This time, the trucks weren't here to bring his furniture. They were here to reshape the neighborhood, literally and legally. The old dock that the HOA claimed as community property was rebuilt into a private pier. The shoreline was reinforced, cleaned, and lined with fresh markers that clearly defined the property boundary. And when the first "no trespassing" signs went up, the shockwave hit like thunder. Neighbors stared in disbelief. The lake that had once been their pride, their playground, their view, now belonged to someone else. But Ethan didn't lock it away. Instead, he posted a public notice, open access for community use, with one condition: respect the property, and the property will remain open. Some saw it as generous. Others saw it as a reminder of what they had lost, not to greed, but to arrogance. As autumn settled over Lake Meriden, the tension began to shift. The HOA's power was gone. The neighborhood, once loud and controlling, grew quiet. And in that quiet, something strange happened: peace. Yet deep down, Ethan knew this wasn't over. People like Carol didn't fade easily. They waited, plotted, and resurfaced when least expected. And as the leaves turned gold and drifted into the lake, a single thought crossed Ethan's mind. Sometimes, peace isn't the end of a war. It's just the calm before the next one. The first chill of November swept across Lake Meriden, scattering orange leaves across the quiet streets that once buzzed with HOA patrols and gossip. For weeks, the neighborhood had been unusually peaceful. There were no inspection notices, no complaint letters, no late-night arguments about paint colors or lawn lengths. It almost felt normal. But under that fragile calm, something was brewing, something far more dangerous than before. Carol had disappeared from sight since the HOA's collapse. Her house, once the social hub of the community, had its blinds permanently drawn. The "President's Office" sign was gone, replaced by silence. Neighbors assumed she had given up. But those who knew her better, or feared her more, understood that Carol never surrendered quietly. Inside her home, the once pristine living room had turned into a war room. Papers covered the table: property maps, HOA bylaws, county zoning codes, and handwritten notes that spiraled with frustration. At the center sat a single folder marked Cole Holdings LLC. Carol had spent the last few weeks digging into property records, business filings, even court archives. Every night, she pieced together the story of Ethan Cole's ownership. She learned how his company had purchased the lakefront through a forgotten transfer of rights, how the HOA had failed to renew its easement, and how, legally, she had no claim. But Carol didn't see it as defeat. She saw it as a loophole waiting to be exploited. Her discovery came late one night, illuminated by the cold blue glow of her laptop screen. Buried deep in the county's online archive, she found a single line in a decades-old contract, a clause referring to community access privileges subject to environmental and public utility provisions. To a normal person, it meant nothing. To Carol, it was ammunition. By morning, she had already scheduled a meeting with an attorney. The lawyer she hired wasn't local. He was sharp, expensive, and known for taking on impossible cases. His name was Richard Gaines, a corporate bulldog with a reputation for twisting property law until it screamed. Carol didn't just want her power back. She wanted Ethan's reputation ruined, his project stopped, and his name dragged through the mud of public opinion. Within a week, documents began circulating. Carol had filed an injunction against Cole Holdings, claiming Ethan's development violated environmental impact regulations and restricted public access to shared natural resources. It was a long shot, but it didn't need to win, it just needed to cause chaos. The neighborhood, desperate for direction, began to rally behind her again. People wanted someone to blame for the changes, for the private signs, for the fences, for the reminder that their paradise had limits. And Carol was more than willing to lead that anger. Flyers appeared on doors: "Protect our lake. Stop corporate takeover." Emails flooded local officials. Posts popped up on social media accusing Ethan of privatizing nature. Within days, the story spread beyond Lake Meriden. A small local news outlet picked it up, framing it as a battle between a powerful developer and a tight-knit community defending its heritage. The comments section turned into a war zone. Ethan saw the article on a Monday morning. He sat on his porch with a cup of black coffee, scrolling through the endless stream of speculation. The words "greedy developer" and "corporate bully" flashed repeatedly. He wasn't angry, not yet. But he was disappointed. He had tried to handle everything quietly, respectfully, and within the law. And now, the same people who had called the cops on him were painting themselves as victims. Still, Ethan knew how to fight, and he didn't fight with emotion. He fought with strategy. That afternoon, he called his own lawyer, a calm, unshakable woman named Dana Mercer. She specialized in real estate litigation and had handled far larger storms than this. After reviewing Carol's claims, she let out a small laugh. "She's trying to use expired environmental provisions to claim community access," Dana said. "It's not going to hold. But she might cause enough noise to attract regulators." "Then let her," Ethan replied quietly. "The truth will drown the noise." But the noise grew louder. Carol's campaign gained momentum. She appeared on a local TV segment, standing by the lake, her voice filled with conviction and rehearsed sincerity. She spoke about corporate greed destroying community values and a developer who tricked homeowners. The cameras loved her, she knew exactly how to perform outrage. The next day, protesters arrived. Not many, maybe a dozen at most, but enough to make headlines. They stood near the entrance of the private road, waving handmade signs, "Save Lake Meriden," and "No corporate takeover." Ethan didn't confront them. He didn't call the police. He just watched from his office window as the wind rippled the lake, the same lake they were supposedly saving from him. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Dana was working relentlessly. She compiled the original deeds, environmental studies, and all the transfer records that proved Ethan's ownership. She sent copies to the county office, to local journalists, and even to the state environmental board. Within a week, Carol's lawsuit began to unravel. But Carol wasn't done. When the legal front began to crumble, she switched tactics: public shaming. She started an online blog, posting snippets of Ethan's business history, exaggerating connections, and twisting every fact into a villain narrative. Her followers grew. The HOA might have been gone, but she had found a new throne: digital outrage. Still, beneath her fury, something else lingered: fear. Because deep down, Carol knew Ethan wasn't just another homeowner. He was deliberate, measured, and too composed to be ordinary. Rumors started to swirl that he was planning to redevelop the entire lakeside, that he had already purchased 2 more properties in silence. Some neighbors began to side with him, realizing he might actually increase their property values. Others clung to Carol's crusade, desperate to keep control of something that was already gone. The community fractured again, this time beyond repair. As the weeks passed, the courtroom drama fizzled out. The judge dismissed Carol's case for lack of standing. The environmental claims were thrown out. But the damage to her reputation was permanent. Then came Ethan's counterstroke. Without warning, his company released official renderings of the Lake Meriden restoration project. It wasn't a development, it was a renewal. The plan detailed eco-friendly pathways, new docks for residents, water treatment installations, and free public access days each month. Every move, every image, was calculated to show transparency, generosity, and control. The public turned instantly. The same media that painted him as a villain now called him a visionary restoring community values. Carol's name vanished from the headlines as fast as it had appeared. But what really destroyed her was the final blow: a certified letter delivered directly to her doorstep. Inside was a single-page notice. Due to repeated acts of harassment, defamation, and unlawful interference, Cole Holdings hereby revokes any implied access privileges from the property located at 18 Lakeshore Drive, effective immediately. That was Carol's address. She stood at her door, reading the letter in disbelief. The woman who once dictated how every neighbor lived had just been told how she would live. For the first time, she was on the other side of her own rules. That night, her lights went dark again. No more meetings. No more patrols. No more control. Just silence, and the faint sound of waves brushing against a shoreline she no longer ruled. Ethan watched from his deck, not out of spite, but reflection. He hadn't sought revenge, just justice. And in the stillness of that November evening, the lake looked peaceful again, almost grateful. But as he turned to go inside, his phone buzzed. A message from Dana. They filed an appeal, it read. Same lawyer. Same plaintiff. Ethan exhaled slowly, looking back at the darkened houses across the lake. The war wasn't over. Carol had just changed the battlefield. The first snow of December blanketed Lake Meriden like a thin sheet of glass, quiet, reflective, deceptive. On the surface, everything seemed calm. The water lay still, the houses shimmered beneath the frost, and the air carried that rare winter silence that makes sound itself feel heavy. But beneath that calm, the tension that had gripped the lake for months was about to erupt again, louder, sharper, and far more personal than before. Ethan Cole had been spending most of his mornings in his office overlooking the lake, reviewing project documents and construction schedules for the Lake Meriden Restoration Project. The initiative had already begun to transform the community's perception of him. He was no longer the outsider or the corporate invader. He was becoming, at least in the public eye, the man who saved their lake. But the peace was short-lived. One Thursday afternoon, as Ethan was finalizing permit extensions, his phone rang. It was Dana, his attorney. Her tone was calm, but there was a weight in her voice that Ethan recognized instantly, the kind of tone that comes right before a storm. She filed an appeal, Dana said. And this time, it's not just her. Ethan leaned back, eyes narrowing. Who's backing her? The County Environmental Coalition, Dana replied. And 2 former HOA members. They formed a public petition claiming your project violates state conservation laws. They're using environmental protection as a weapon. Ethan exhaled slowly, staring out at the icy water. It was brilliant, in a ruthless way. Carol had lost her legal case, her reputation, even her access. But she had found a new way to strike back, by wrapping her vendetta in the language of public good. Within days, signs reappeared around the neighborhood: Save our lake. Stop corporate exploitation. Protect Meriden wildlife. The same slogans, the same voices, only louder now. Carol had reinvented herself from a failed HOA tyrant into a community activist. And the public, always hungry for drama, ate it up. News crews returned to Lake Meriden, this time filming footage of frozen water and homeowners lamenting loss of natural beauty. Carol stood at the forefront, bundled in a long coat, tears in her eyes as she spoke about fighting for the lake her children grew up around. It was calculated perfection. Ethan watched it all unfold, not with anger, but with quiet disbelief. She wasn't fighting for the lake, she was fighting for control. And once again, she was using every resource, every connection, every trick to reclaim it. This time, however, Ethan wasn't alone. Dana assembled a team of environmental consultants and legal advisors. Together, they drafted a comprehensive response, a 250-page environmental report showing that Ethan's restoration project improved the ecosystem rather than harmed it. The report included detailed water quality data, soil testing results, and even wildlife surveys showing rising fish populations since dredging began. But Carol wasn't after facts. She was after perception. A week later, she held a public town hall meeting at the local community center. It was packed, standing room only. Cameras lined the back wall. News outlets live-streamed the event. The headline read, Lake Meriden residents stand against developers' private control. Ethan didn't attend. He didn't need to. He had already submitted his statement in writing, calm, factual, unshaken. But as the meeting unfolded, the crowd's emotions ignited. Carol's voice trembled with carefully staged sincerity. She spoke of corporate greed, of vanishing traditions, of outsiders taking what isn't theirs. Then she unveiled her trump card, a video clip edited to show construction crews dumping debris into the lake. The audience gasped. Proof, she declared. Proof of destruction. But it wasn't proof. The clip was doctored. The footage came from years earlier, before Ethan even bought the property. But by the time fact-checkers discovered that, the damage was already done. Social media lit up overnight. Headlines screamed about environmental negligence at Lake Meriden. Ethan's inbox flooded with interview requests, legal threats, and hate mail. For the first time since he arrived, Ethan felt the weight of public misunderstanding pressing on him. His team advised him to issue a statement immediately, but he refused to rush. He believed truth spoke louder when delivered with precision, not panic. So he waited. 2 days later, when the snow turned to sleet, Ethan broke his silence. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't post on social media. Instead, he invited the same news outlets that had aired Carol's claims to the property itself. When the reporters arrived, they were met not with protest signs or angry rhetoric, but with transparency. Ethan walked them along the lake's perimeter, showing every detail of the restoration process, eco-barriers, water filtration units, and replanting efforts that had already begun to revive native vegetation. He presented documentation, time-stamped drone footage, and environmental certificates, undeniable proof that his work was improving, not damaging, the lake. The cameras captured everything, including the moment he stood on the dock and said quietly, "Sometimes, the loudest voices aren't the most honest ones. They're just the ones most afraid to lose control." The segment aired that evening. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't sensational. But it was real. And slowly, it began to turn the tide. Public opinion started to shift. The Environmental Coalition quietly withdrew from Carol's appeal after reviewing Ethan's evidence. 2 former HOA members released statements distancing themselves from her. The county announced it would not pursue further investigation. But Carol refused to quit. She doubled down once more, filing complaints to the state level, this time accusing Ethan of unfairly restricting community access to the shoreline. Her argument was weak, redundant, and desperate, but it bought her attention. One frigid January morning, Ethan received an official notice: a state inspector would be visiting the property. Not unexpected, but still inconvenient. He prepared thoroughly, organizing every document, every permit, every correspondence into perfect order. When the inspector arrived, she was professional, polite, and thorough. She walked the shoreline, examined construction zones, verified boundaries, and reviewed environmental compliance logs. Hours passed in silence. Then, as the sun began to dip below the frozen trees, she finally looked at Ethan and said the words that ended months of tension in a single breath. "Everything's in perfect compliance. You've done good work here, Mr. Cole." The report came back spotless. Every accusation Carol made, false. Every attempt to smear him, dismantled by evidence. 2 days later, the state officially dismissed her appeal. The news broke publicly at dawn. Ethan didn't celebrate, he didn't need to. The silence that followed was victory enough. Across the lake, in her once proud home, Carol sat alone, scrolling through the article that confirmed her defeat. The words blurred before her eyes, but she didn't need to read them, she already knew what they said. Her campaign had failed. Her followers were gone. Her name was now associated with the very word she used against others: control. That evening, she stepped outside for the first time in weeks. Snowflakes fell softly over the frozen water. The dock lights from Ethan's property shimmered across the lake like tiny fires. She stared at them, not with hatred anymore, but with something closer to exhaustion. The war she started had taken everything from her: her authority, her credibility, her community. And for what? To prove a point that never existed. Ethan, standing on his side of the lake, saw her silhouette for a moment, just a faint figure against the snow. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He simply turned, walked back inside, and closed the door. That winter night, Lake Meriden finally slept in peace. The lawsuits were over. The protests gone. The noise silenced. But somewhere deep in the quiet of that frozen neighborhood, both Ethan and Carol knew one truth: battles like this don't end with papers or signatures. They end with lessons. And while Ethan had won control of the lake, Carol had learned the hardest lesson of all: control means nothing without respect. Winter slowly faded from Lake Meriden, leaving behind thawing shores and a strange, hollow quiet. The lake's frozen surface cracked open in the early days of March, releasing the muffled echoes of everything that had happened over the past year. It was as if the water itself exhaled, weary from carrying too many secrets. For the first time in months, Ethan Cole could breathe. The inspectors were gone, the lawsuits dismissed, the cameras silent. The construction along the lakeside neared completion: clean pathways, restored wetlands, and a small community park now stood where derelict docks had once rotted. It wasn't just a victory, it was transformation. Yet, in the middle of that calm, something still lingered: unfinished business, an invisible thread tethering him to the one person who had tried to destroy him. Carol Matthews. No one in the neighborhood saw much of her anymore. After the state dismissed her final appeal, she withdrew from every HOA committee, deleted her social media, and sold her car. Rumors spread that she was preparing to move out of Lake Meriden entirely. Some said she was too ashamed to stay. Others believed she was simply tired of fighting a war she could never win. But Ethan didn't believe it was over. Not really. Because people like Carol don't just disappear, they fade. Slowly. Reluctantly. And sometimes, they return for one last move. It happened one rainy morning in late March. The day had started quietly, gray skies stretching over the lake like a sheet of dull steel. Ethan was reviewing maintenance schedules in his office when his assistant buzzed in. "There's someone at the front gate," she said. "Says her name is Carol Matthews." Ethan didn't speak for a moment. He looked out the window at the slow drizzle blurring the reflection of his lake. It had been months since he'd even heard her name spoken aloud. "Let her in," he finally said. The black SUV rolled up the gravel driveway, tires crunching over wet stones. When Carol stepped out, she wasn't the iron-fisted HOA president who once barked orders at neighbors. She looked smaller, wrapped in a raincoat too big for her frame, eyes dulled by exhaustion. Her confidence had melted into something more fragile, not quite regret, but something close. She didn't ask to come inside. She simply stood on the porch as rain dripped from the roof's edge, forming tiny rivers down the steps. Ethan joined her under the awning. The two of them faced the lake, the same lake that had bound them in conflict, now glimmering faintly beneath the rain. There were no words spoken, no apologies exchanged. Just silence, heavy with things that didn't need to be said anymore. Finally, Carol broke it. Her voice was quiet, flat. "You were right," she said. "About everything." Ethan didn't respond. He wasn't looking for her validation. But she continued, her tone distant, as if talking to the lake instead of him. "I thought I was protecting this place," she said. "I thought that if I held on tight enough, I could keep it the way it was. But it was never about the lake, was it? It was about control. About not wanting to fade out of relevance." Ethan turned his head slightly, studying her profile. There was something strange in her expression, not remorse exactly, but recognition. The kind that comes when someone finally sees themselves clearly for the first time. "I'm selling my house," she said after a pause. "The one across the cove. Closing's next week. Just thought you should hear it from me." Ethan nodded. The words didn't surprise him, but they carried a strange finality, like the closing of a long, painful chapter. Carol hesitated, then looked toward the water. "You did good with the lake," she said softly. "It's better now than it's been in years." He gave a quiet nod, but didn't reply. Compliments from her felt like apologies disguised as observations. The rain grew heavier, streaking across the glassy surface of the lake. Carol took a slow step down the porch, then stopped halfway. "You know," she said, turning slightly, "I don't think people ever hate the way they say they do. They just hate losing control of what they thought was theirs." Her voice broke a little on that last word. Then she walked away, down the path, into the drizzle, past the edge of the property she once tried to rule. Ethan stood there until her car disappeared through the fog. The sound of tires fading into the rain was the quietest ending imaginable for a war that had once been deafening. He stayed outside for a long time, staring at the water. The rain softened into mist, and for a moment, the lake looked endless, clean, unclaimed, free. That evening, as the storm cleared, Ethan stood on the dock with a cup of coffee in hand. Lights from the neighboring homes reflected across the water, tiny halos of gold flickering against the dark. The town had changed, and so had he. He thought of how it all started, a simple move-in day interrupted by flashing red lights, suspicion, and shouting. How one phone call to 911 spiraled into months of chaos. How an HOA president turned neighborly order into tyranny, and how he had unknowingly walked into a battleground disguised as a community. But in the end, it was never just about property lines or power. It was about something deeper, identity, pride, the desperate human need to feel important in a world that keeps changing without permission. Carol wasn't evil. She was afraid. And that fear made her destructive. But Ethan had learned something vital from her: control doesn't come from dominance. It comes from patience, and proof. Weeks passed. Spring returned. The restoration project completed, and Lake Meriden reopened to the public. Families walked along the new trails, kids laughed on the docks, and fishermen cast lines into clear water again. The very community that once turned against Ethan now greeted him warmly. One afternoon, a local reporter visited to document the rebirth of Lake Meriden. During the interview, she asked, "What was the hardest part of this journey?" Ethan smiled faintly and looked out over the shimmering water before answering, convincing people that doing the right thing sometimes means standing alone for a while. The quote ended up in the article's headline. Months later, Ethan received a letter, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a short note on plain stationery. "The lake looks beautiful. I drove past last week. I hope you take good care of it. CM." He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the bottom drawer of his desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that peace isn't always won by fighting harder. Sometimes, it's won by outlasting chaos long enough for the truth to stand on its own. As the sun dipped low across the lake, Ethan stepped outside once more. The water was calm, the wind gentle. He could hear faint laughter from across the cove, new families moving in, fresh voices filling the air. The lake was alive again. He smiled, not with pride, but with quiet relief. Because after everything, the police calls, the lawsuits, the shouting, the rumors, Lake Meriden finally belonged to no one and everyone all at once. And in that balance, Ethan found the peace he'd been chasing since the day he arrived. The same place where they once called 911 on him was now the place he called home.